Hi everyone, and welcome back to TIME100 Talks. If you haven't joined us before, TIME100 Talks is our weekly live event series where we bring together extraordinary leaders from every field to spotlight solutions and encourage action toward a better world. I'm Dan Maxey, executive editor at Time and editorial director of the TIME100. And today, we're here to talk about Pride. Not the parties and the parades and the performances, though we will have two of those, but the movement to ensure equality for every member of the LGBTQ community. I'm a journalist, so it's my job to tell stories. But as an openly gay man, this one is personal for me. When I married my husband in 2018, it was the happiest day of my life. But like so many members of my community, I still live my life every day knowing that even in America, 50 years after the Stonewall Uprising, there are still people, many people, who would deny my right to work, to live, and to love. And I say this as someone who is white and male and cisgender. I have an enormous amount of privilege. So while Pride is about lives like mine, it's really about different lives, especially right now. It's about Black lives and brown lives and trans lives and disabled lives and non-binary lives and all of the lives that exist at the intersections of those identities. It's about empowering the queer community in all of its facets and embracing the allies who support them. And you will hear from many of those voices today. Joining us are writer, producer, creator, and actors Lena Waithe and Ryan O'Connell, both of whom are blazing new trails in queer storytelling. Sir Elton John and David Furnish are with us. They will be speaking with Katie Couric about how the lessons learned through the AIDS crisis can apply to the COVID-19 pandemic today, as well as the impact of philanthropy in general. Representative Ayanna Pressley joins us today. She will talk about police reform and the continued fight for equality in America. Carlos Alvarado Quesada, the president of Costa Rica, is also with us. Costa Rica recently became the first country in Central America to legalize same-sex marriage, and we will talk with him about that and more. We'll also be joined by Laverne Cox, actor, activist, and producer, and Chase Strangio, one of the lawyers behind the landmark Supreme Court ruling that LGBTQ people are protected from job discrimination under federal civil rights law. And we'll have a conversation with the talented singer-songwriter Hayley Kiyoko, who will perform 2 songs during today's talk. I'd like to thank our partners at P&G for all they're doing to help make these really important conversations possible. And now, to kick off our show, I'm excited to welcome singer, songwriter, and advocate Hayley Kiyoko.
I gave it all to you, left me exhausted, and the least you can do, not make me nauseous, watching you, I'm deep in quicksand, I'm falling into you, I'm into you, still into you, guilty promises, get me off of this, if you let me
Thank you, Hayley, for that amazing performance. I'm excited to speak with you later in the show. Now, I'd like to welcome Time national correspondent Charlotte Alter, who will be speaking with U.S. Representative Ayanna Pressley about working toward change in America.
Thanks, Dan. I'm Charlotte Alter, and I'm so happy to be joined by Representative Ayanna Pressley here today. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So obviously, this is Pride Month, and you've led your colleagues last year in observing the Trans Day of Remembrance. So I want to ask you, what specifically should Congress be doing to protect trans people, and especially trans people of color who are disproportionately at risk right now?
We should be doing for trans individuals what we should be doing for everyone, and that is ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to do more than just merely survive, which is what's true, and that's just barely for most trans individuals, but the opportunity to thrive. It means a life of freedom from fear. It means not facing discrimination when trying to rent a home, to buy a home, to be gainfully employed. And so what do we need to do? We need to do what we should be doing for everyone, and that is centering the voices and the lived experiences and struggles from our trans family and neighbors, and then working with them to develop the best solutions to ensure that they lead a life where they're thriving. And so one thing that we can do is pass the Equality Act, but
So tell me more about the Equality Act and what specifically it would do on this issue.
Yeah, well, again, I live in Massachusetts, and it has been, one of the things that has frustrated me is that, that we are a pace setter when it comes to the fight for marriage equality. And there are many that, and then we had, we're a pace setter when it comes to the issue of public accommodation as well. And so I find that people would define the issue of equality by those two issues of marriage equality and in public accommodation. But our activism must continue because, again, discrimination persists because it is systemic and it is structural at every level. And that is why we have to ensure that, again, that there are no barriers to employment, to housing, to healthcare justice. When we say equality, we mean equality. That's a life, again, of freedom from fear and the equality of opportunity to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. I mean, it's really just as basic as that. It's just the thing that just comes up for me over and over again in all of my conversations with my LGBT friends and neighbors is just equality and freedom from fear, which so many live in. Being able to stand in your truth, to live your authentic life.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, how does COVID-19 exacerbate some of these existing inequalities? And what can be done about that?
Yeah. Okay, so first I just have to center, since it is Pride Month, and we did just have this Supreme Court victory, which again, it is disheartening that we have to legislate fairness. But since we are in Pride Month, I just want to first center history and just, talk about the role of Black trans women. We would not have an LGBT plus movement were it not for Black trans women who quite literally put their bodies on the line. And as Marsha P. Johnson reminds us, there can be no pride for some of us without liberation for all of us, right? And so today, members of the LGBTQ plus community continue to be disproportionately targeted, discriminated against. We see Black trans women being murdered at disproportionately higher rates. And so these injustices, again, that are structural, they're cultural practices, they're codified in lawmaking, certainly in the midst of COVID-19, for any marginalized community, which the LGBTQ plus community is, that hurt is going to be worsened and exacerbated. And so we knew anecdotally that these communities, that our communities would be hardest hit. But that's one of the reasons why I fought early on for the collection of data to ensure that there would be an equitable public health response when it comes to testing and when it comes to treatment, because we already know that these communities suffer from unequal access to healthcare, embedded biases within our healthcare system that will often ignore or delegitimize our pain. And we saw that playing out. And so, there's the comorbidities of structural racism and homophobia and transphobia. The only thing that COVID-19 could not kill was racism and homophobia and transphobia. And so that's certainly what I think COVID-19 has done. It has laid to bear and exacerbated those hurts and those inequities that already existed, particularly when it comes to access to healthcare, and because it has given that Black and Latinx communities have been more susceptible to contracting COVID. The virus doesn't discriminate, but we're more susceptible to contracting it. And then when we do, we suffer the worst consequences. And that has everything to do with living in subpar housing, being in proximity to environmental injustices, living in a food apartheid system, living in, all of these things. And so it's hard to speak about these things succinctly because they truly are all interconnected, which is why I think it's so important that our movements continue to be inclusive and intersectional, because our freedoms and our destinies are truly tied. If there's anything that we should have learned under the Trump administration, someone who is an equal opportunity bigot, offender, and abuser, is that we have got to all be in this together.
So on that note, I think this is a good opportunity to turn to the primaries that just happened this week. They're obviously still counting the votes, but it looks like Richie Torres and Mondaire Jones are likely to be the first openly gay Black members of Congress. How do you think the progressive movement has changed even in the last couple of years since you ran in 2018?
Well, it wasn't that long ago when I was running for the Boston City Council and, just being fully transparent, because I don't know how to be anything else but that. The progressive movement didn't always seem inclusive. It was mostly, the progressive movement was not diverse. It was not inclusive or representative of marginalized communities. And so now you see that we are the face of that movement. And that makes sense because by very definition, the progressive movement is about progress. And so how can you make progress if you're not bringing everyone along, if you're not being disruptive, if you're not shaking the table, if you're not centering, holding space for everyone? And so these primary victories are exciting. They are emboldening. I'm a firm believer that the people closest to the pain should be the closest to the power, driving and informing the policymaking. And again, against the backdrop of this administration, who's only been making this discrimination worse by actively and continually marginalizing members of the LGBTQIA community, launching attacks against their ability to access healthcare, enjoy parenthood, to serve in our military, and so much more. It's so important that we have folks that are willing to bring that representation and to ensure that we center those voices. So it's very exciting. Representation matters.
So I want to get back to something you said earlier about sort of how all of these movements intersect with each other. So what do you think? Obviously, we are in a period of immense activism around racial justice. How do you think the Black Lives Matter movement of the last couple weeks has shaped the results that we saw or that are continuing to come out from this week's primaries?
Well, these are old fights, but it's a new moment. And you do feel that we are in the midst of a reckoning and a paradigm shift. We have to continue to organize, to mobilize, to protest, to demonstrate. We have to be called out and to make sure that our movements are keeping pace with the hurt. And that means centering Tony McDade. That means that when we say their names, that we are saying all names, that if Black Lives Matter, that we're unapologetic and affirming that means Black trans lives matter, that Black LGBTQIA lives matter, and that we back that up. Because the only receipts that matter, hashtags and likes and retweets, that's cool and we appreciate solidarity. But what matters now is law change and budget change. That's what matters most. And so I do think that, this uprising, which exists because, listen, for as long as there's unrest in Black lives, there will be unrest in the streets. The tipping point has been the most recent murders of unarmed Black folk. But that's not the only reason folks are in the street. They're in the street for every structural, systemic, racial injustice and hurt that has been targeted and very precise in its focus on Black Americans for centuries. This hurt is not organic. It has been legislated. It has been codified. Disproportionate hate, hurt, and harm hoisted onto Black communities born out of the original sin of slavery, from unequal access to the GI Bill, to Jim Crow, to the war on drugs, to redlining. And so we have to be precise and prescriptive in our response and in our solutions. And the early stages of the civil rights movement, which some people, I guess, thought we weren't still in, we are still in it. This is just a furthering and advancing of that work and that movement. If you look at the Montgomery bus boycotts, the Greensboro sit-ins, the Freedom Rides, those were respectively 6 months, 3 months, 392 days. What are we in, like 20 plus days? So the movement continues to grow. And I do think that momentum did help to that broad, deep, and diverse coalition that we see in response to injustice did help and support these incredible candidates in their races on the ground. It's a reckoning. It's a new moment. Again, old fights, but we're in a new moment.
So, on that note, you mentioned budgets and solutions. And one of the major demands of this movement is to defund the police. So I'm wondering, first of all, do you support defunding the police? And what does defunding mean to you? Does it mean reducing the budget? Does it mean abolishing the police altogether? What is your thinking on defunding?
Let me just say this, it's really frustrating, not only to have your culture appropriated, but also to have movements undermined. The legacy of community organizers is to build community. It is not to destroy community, which is why it was so frustrating in the early days of the Black Lives Matter protest in the wake of George Floyd, that there were infiltrators coming in to undermine that movement. And again, community organizers who honor that legacy of Black freedom fighters and writers before them is to build community, not to destroy it. And so I offer that to say that we can't allow the defund movement to be co-opted either. This is simply about a refund. This is about true reparations. This is about investment in communities. There's a reason why the Congressional Black Caucus submits an alternative budget every year, because we know that our communities have been historically under-resourced, underinvested in, and divested in. I remember in my early tenure in Congress, having just returned from the border, and there were votes that were imminently coming before us. And I said, I'm just so tired of the lives of Black and Brown families and our children being moderated and put on a shelf, we'll get to you. And so that has certainly been true and reflected in our budgets. Now, I've been in Congress 2 years, but I'm not new to this work. I served on the Boston City Council for 8 years. And so I remember those unjust choices that were being hoisted upon me. And I would vote those budgets down. I was not going to choose between an accredited librarian, a paraprofessional, and a school nurse. Certainly if that meant that we were going to fund more school police than school nurses. And so, yes, I support the defund movement, because this is about the investment in our communities, which have historically been divested from. And let me just give you quick, 3 examples. Of course, our first responders have a role to play in society, but they need to play a role in every part of society, and they don't want to. So police officers don't need to come to the school because, two students are engaged in an altercation. If we make the investment in social workers and social emotional wellness, in school nurses, in counselors and psychotherapists, we know what works. We know what supports our students in their readiness to learn and what makes learning communities safer. It's trauma-informed learning communities. It's restorative justice practices. It's teachers who will ask you what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you. We know what works and we don't fund it. Why are we deploying the police when there is an individual who's battling mental illness? We should be deploying a mental health clinician. Why are our police officers administering Narcan when we should be investing in on-demand treatment, substance use, and culturally competent care? So we know what works, we just haven't funded it. And so this is the reckoning. And so if you're going to affirm that Black Lives Matter, that means Black data matters. That means Black research matters. That means that Black home ownership matters. That means that Black students matter. That means that Black educators matter. And it means that Black lives being valued in our laws and in our budgets matter. And this is the time.
So I want to ask you about your bill to end qualified immunity, which you've worked on with conservative Justin Amash. So what was it like to work with somebody on this bill who you have a lot of differences with? There's a lot of places where the two of you are not aligned. I'm wondering if you can tell me where you see room for real bipartisan agreement on criminal justice reform, and also what it was like to work with Representative Amash on this.
Yeah, well, this actually isn't the first time that we've come together and done work together. He was supportive of my bill to abolish the death penalty, which is a tenet out of a larger piece of legislation that I introduced called the People's Justice Guarantee, a radical reimagining of our criminal legal system. And so we have already done work together. And on this, the issue of qualified immunity, and let me just say, yes, if you believe that Black Lives Matter, then you will support our legislation to end qualified immunity, these set of protections created by the Supreme Court and then really strengthened in court case after court case. If you believe that Black Lives Matter, then justice for the Black lives that we have been robbed of matters. Although I have to acknowledge that true justice would be that George Floyd and Tony McDade and Breonna Taylor, or even locally in my own district, Burrell Ramsey and Terrence Coleman would still be alive. But if there cannot be true justice, there must be accountability. And ending qualified immunity would ensure that, because no one should be above the law, including law enforcement. No one should be above the law. If you are a lawyer and you violate someone's civil rights, then you can be taken to account for negligence. If you are a doctor, you can be sued for malpractice. And so, if people are going to operate, if law enforcement who have taken a vow to serve and to protect, and I'm leading with I should lead with the protect and serve, that's the point. To do that, they should not be operating with reckless impunity and callous disregard for human life, for Black lives, without any retribution or any consequences, without any justice. And so, our bill has to pass to eliminate these protections.
Congresswoman, so you've mentioned that we need to be precise about addressing this issue. So what are some of your recommendations for how best to address police brutality?
Okay, so I've already introduced a congressional resolution to condemn police brutality, racial profiling, and excessive use of force. I do believe in this moment that congressional intent is a powerful tool. We've used it as a values frame when it comes to foreign policy. And in this moment, Congress must act as the conscience of our nation. So I do think going on the record on that is very important. And Senator Warren and I, we've introduced the Andrew Kearsey Act, which would require police and correction officers to provide medical care to people in need that are in their custody. And that was directly born out of a conversation that myself and Senator Warren had with surviving family members who've been robbed of their loved ones due to police brutality or due to to medical negligence, or what I would consider criminal negligence. And so that's what happened. Mr. Kiersey, Andrew Kiersey, a father of four, he was in police custody. He was saying that he couldn't breathe, that he was experiencing intense chest pains, and there was no medical intervention, no ambulance was called, and he died of cardiac arrest. And so that's what the Andrew Kiersey Act would address, and hopefully prevent any future tragedies. Even when we saw with the Rayshard killing in Atlanta, that after he was murdered, that officer was picking up shell casings instead of even checking for the medical state of Rayshard. So, I mean, again, the stuff runs so deep in terms of the dehumanization and the objectifying of Black and brown bodies. And so I do think by ending qualified immunity and then passing the Andrew Kiersey Act, that does get us closer to progress. Not to justice, because justice would be them all being alive still, but it does get us closer to progress. Federal, state, and municipal.
Yeah. So I want to talk about leadership for a second, because as you mentioned, the civil rights movement was very long. There was a prolonged period of activism. One big difference between this moment and the civil rights movement is that in the 1950s and 60s, there were a handful of very clear and visible leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis and Rosa Parks. And this movement that we're experiencing right now is much more leaderful and is structured in a way that allows anybody to take up the mantle, anybody to participate, anybody to be a leader of the Black Lives Matter movement or to start a demonstration anywhere in the country. Why do you think the movement works this way, and what are the benefits and drawbacks of that structure?
Yeah, the benefits is that if you have an equality of opportunity in activism, in movement, and in coalition building, then you don't have to deal with what we often dealt with on the back end was in the absence of those leaders, have you appropriately, mentored or succession planned, who will stand in the gap? And so no movement should rest on the shoulders of any one person or individual that flies in the face of what a movement is. It is about the masses. It is about community. It is about coalition. And so I think that's a good thing. And I think that's why it will be more sustainable. Because, this work, as rewarding as it is, it can certainly be depleting. And so when you have a movement that's this big and this strengthened and this multi-generational, I think it supports the restoration of everyone while doing this work. You can't pour from an empty cup. I know many times when I have been tempted to curl up in a fetal position just from the gravity and the scale and the scope of the hurt, to go out there and to be in community and to be a part of a movement. And what the early days of the civil rights movement taught us, they gave us the blueprint. You're not just organizing for the sake of organizing. The whole point is to organize, it is to mobilize, and it is to legislate. And so I'm very grateful for the support of many of those movement builders who do support the bill introduced by myself and Representative Amash to end qualified immunity, to get us one step closer to justice and accountability.
So when I talked to Jess Morales-Ricchetto and Jessica Bird a couple of weeks ago here on Time 100 Talks, they talked about the importance of non-Black allies participating in this movement. So I'm wondering how your friends in Congress have been supporting you. And, over the last couple of weeks, have you been texting with other members of the squad, and what have those conversations been like?
Sure. Well, we're sisters for real. So yes, we have a text thread and we're in communication all the time. And one of our sisters recently lost her father to COVID, Representative Ilhan Omar. So we're in regular communication about the work and about each other's lives, and trying to make sure that we stay fortified, for the many fights that we're in and that are ahead of us. So far as my colleagues that are not people of color or not Black, specifically, sure, a number of people have reached out just to check in, to offer their support, or to ask questions. I introduced a resolution within hours of the murder of George Floyd. And the resolution was a congressional resolution to condemn police brutality, racial profiling, excessive force, the militarization of our police. And several members reached out just wanting me to better define for them, what does demilitarization mean? And they come from different districts, certainly share my values, but just wanted to better understand, those tenets and what that meant. So there's a lot of conversations like that. And I appreciate that people are asking the questions. This is a moment, if you're going to truly be woke, if you're experiencing some epiphanies in this moment about just how pervasive and systemic the hurt has been disproportionately for Black Americans, you have to ask questions. And so, I would just say what I've said to them, which is, at this moment, we need you to be more than allies. And I appreciate your acknowledging your power and your privilege, but we need more than guilt. We need more than hashtags and likes and retweets. This is, again, about law change. This is about budget change. We're in the midst of a culture shift, but what we need to see is a power shift. And that, again, has everything to do with representation and who's around policy and decision-making tables, as much as it is about the laws that we pass and what we invest in our budgets, and who we invest in our budgets.
So speaking of who's around the table, it looks like, as I mentioned earlier, it looks like Jamal Bowman is very likely to be joining you in Congress next year. Can he be in the squad?
Well, we have the same haircuts, so I'm certainly open. But what I will just say is that, first of all, I was very proud to endorse Jamal in his candidacy. And the squad is certainly bigger than any 4 members of Congress. Those are my sisters, and we have a tremendous kinship because we've walked a unique path in being first, those unique joys and pains, and we certainly have shared values. But at the end of the day, anyone doing the work of building a more equitable and just world is a member of the squad. Oh, and if you can wear this lipstick shade, so you're in too.
Oh, great, thanks.
Come on.
Well, Representative Pressley, I really appreciate you taking the time to be here today. And thank you so much for joining us. And I hope you have a great Pride celebration.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte and Representative Pressley. In a moment, we'll be joined by Katie Couric, who will be speaking with Sir Elton John and David Furnish. But first, we recently caught up with DJ Pierce, perhaps better known as Shangela, about how to support the drag community during this pandemic.
I think I learned how to be a better gay person, a better person, because I became a better queen. And that's because I learned to walk with my head higher than I ever expected to. And in doing that, I kind of harnessed all the parts of me. I not only started celebrating just me in drag, but I started celebrating me out of drag and going, you know what? I'm great all the way around. I love me. And we have to do that for ourselves because the world won't always be there to do it for you.
Good morning and welcome to Paris, Texas, where we're having a new
I am living that fully socially distant lifestyle right now. I am quarantining here at my grandmother's house in Paris, Texas, where I grew up and have not been back this long since I was in high school. I was jogging to the gym yesterday. Yes, there's a gym in Paris that I'm going to get myself back together for season 2 of We're Here. And I was running and this man pulls over a truck in front of me and I'm like, oh Lord, what's about to go down here? Let me just look around safely, what's the tea? And he gets out, he's like, hey, aren't you the one from the HBO show? And I was like, yes, sir. He's like, yeah, I saw you. Me and my wife love you. Come here, get a picture with me. And he's like banging on the truck for his son to get out and take the picture. The son's like, oh my God, Dad, this is so embarrassing. But it was really nice to see that, in a place where I grew up where there was never any gay visibility or queer support. Now I'm finding there's more pockets of support, I guess, than I thought there were. One thing I always say about drag queens, though, is we're some of the most resourceful people in the biz, all right? But it's hard. I mean, the shutdown of nightlife because of COVID-19 has really strongly affected the drag community like nothing really has before. And we've been hit with issues like unemployment. I remember having a conversation with one of my fellow drag performers who was saying, girl, I don't know if I'm going to have to choose next month whether to pay rent or to buy these groceries. So I actually teamed up with the Actors Fund recently and launched a new initiative called Feed the Queens to help fundraise $100,000. And we're going to take that $100,000 and put it right back into the drag community to fight hunger by providing 1,000 or more queens with grocery gift cards. If you want to set the party off, they call a queen, okay? You want to have a good time, you call a queen. You want to get some confidence and see some love, you call a queen. Well, now the queens are calling on you. That's what I like to say. I've participated in pride parades all over the world, okay? Shangela has been around, Paula, look. And we're pivoting right now because of this pandemic. But this is still a time that we can uplift and celebrate being a proud LGBTQIA+ person. There's just a different way that we're doing it this year. I was so happy to see so many come out recently and support the All Black Lives Matter movement. And that's how we're pivoting. We are recognizing that the importance is for us to pay attention to this long-standing thing of systemic racism, oppression, injustice, and police brutality. And people are saying no more, which is exactly what Pride came out of, right? It was born out of these moments of protest when it used to be illegal on the books to just even be gay, to just dress as the opposite sex. I could have been put in jail just for being Shangela. Can you imagine? So there are lots of great things that are coming out of these horrible situations, but it's reminding us it's important that we be heard and raise our voices. For all of those who have fought to get us to this moment, now it's our turn to fight, to make sure that we don't go backwards, but we move forward.
I grew up being told that people like me were ugly, that we were perverts. And I know that when I first transitioned, I didn't used to get out of the house for weeks at a time because I was so ashamed.
When I was young, when I was a child, I always saw big, voluminous, dark brown hair, and I always wanted that.
Cuanto más largo era mi pelo, más visible era yo para el resto del mundo.
Penso che sia importante che anche la vista possa capire quello che c'è dentro.
One day you may walk down the street with the wind blowing in your hair and just feel so happy to be alive.
Whether you're trans or not, I think what trans people are showing is that we're allowed to exist in ways beyond what we've been told.
Sir Elton John and David Furnish, I'm so happy to see you both. We're living in such interesting transformational times. I'm curious what you think of everything that's going on right now.
Oh God, it's the most unusual time. I'm 73 years of age. I've never known anything like this before. I've lived through terrible times and unsettling times before, but nothing like this. First of all, with the virus, and then of course, with the census killing that happened in Minneapolis. And, you know, it's just amplified, but the world has to change. It has to change the way it thinks about the planet. It has to change the way people think about Black lives. You know, we've lived through Black people being killed before, but this, I think, is a real turning point, and it has to happen. And we have to make sure it happens. You know, the system is rigged against the Black people from the word go. From the educational point of view, we're now noticing within our own organization, which is concentrating on AIDS and helping people with AIDS, is amplifying that situation as well. And I hope out of this comes some real change.
David, I think that we've all known this problem exists, but have been guilty of not doing enough to address these issues. It really does feel like there's such urgency now, and it is absolutely imperative that we all work together.
Without question, the mantra of the Elton John AIDS Foundation has always been, no one gets left behind. And what we saw with HIV/AIDS when it started in the 80s is it affected one marginalized community, but then grew to become the biggest disease that affected the entire planet. We are all linked. We're all linked together, and we all need to put our arms around each other and help each other. With HIV and AIDS, now we see a disproportionate number of new infections amongst Black African Americans. They're 13% of the population, but they're responsible for 42% of all the new infections. And COVID has shone a light on that as well, because we've seen a disproportionately large number of people with COVID, African Americans affected by COVID as well. And it's the same socioeconomic problems that we face with HIV/AIDS that are coming to the forefront. 50% of gay Black men in America will contract HIV in their lifetime. 50%, 1 in 2.
Unbelievable.
And that is such a staggering statistic. And it really shows and shines a big light on the work that we have to do, and the specific areas where that work needs to take place.
Why is that number so high?
That number is so high for socioeconomic reasons. It's a combination of a lack of access to healthcare, stigma within certain communities, heavily religious communities, particularly in the Deep South, can be very, very homophobic. Something that we've seen with HIV around the world is where LGBT people are criminalized or discriminated against, we see higher rates of HIV infection across the entire population. You stigmatize LGBT people, you stigmatize AIDS. And as a result, the whole chemistry around AIDS, am I positive? Do I need a test? I'm scared to get a test. I'm scared to pick up my medication. I'm scared to tell somebody. All of that fear prevents people from getting the information and the support that they need to deal with living with HIV. The medical news has never been greater. We can end AIDS today. Everybody had access to testing and access to treatment. There would be no new infections in the world today. But what's taking longer to catch up is the attitudinal change and the stigma that still continues to hold us back.
It's interesting what you both pointed out about the disproportionate number of Black people who are being diagnosed with HIV/AIDS, because when you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, we're seeing the same thing. It's disproportionately affecting Black and brown people.
It really comes down to access to affordable health care, and it's a big issue. I think public health care, COVID has shone a light globally on real gaps in the public healthcare system that we need to have on our planet to protect people and provide them with the appropriate healthcare. The earlier we can get everyone into a health system where they can get regular care, you can address all of those chronic underlying conditions that are making COVID worse, things like high blood pressure and diabetes. And HIV management is what we know, and we know very well. And when we've gone into communities and we've been able to, through community outreach, provide healthcare for people, make healthcare more accessible, get information to them, and get them onto treatment, they live longer, fuller, healthier lives. And the infrastructures that we put in place with HIV/AIDS, we found in Africa, for example, when Ebola happened many, many years ago, there was no healthcare system in Africa. HIV came along and hit the whole continent in a very big way. The healthcare system that the HIV/AIDS warriors put in place was then applicable to Ebola, and they were able to deal with Ebola much more quickly because there were already community outreach people, there were already community healthcare workers, and those people were in place and already had a relationship with people talking about their health. It's getting people into a system that they can access and that they can afford. That's the most important thing.
Also, it's identifying the regions that need to be helped the most. For example, in London, there are 3 boroughs where you find that the biggest rise in infections in HIV. So what we've done in the hospital in South London, people can go, everyone who goes to the hospital, anyone can have an HIV test for free and find out their status. And it's been an incredible.
And we also have included HIV testing as part of any outpatient blood work that's done. We put the HIV test in with their blood work. They're told about it at the time, but we pick up a whole swath of undetected HIV. And the sooner we get people on the medications, the longer and healthier they'll live. The longer we leave it unchecked, they'll get sicker, they'll get more chronic infections, and they run the risk of spreading the disease onto other people. So it's early detection of HIV/AIDS is absolutely critical to ending this.
This is what has come to our attention because of COVID, because of George Floyd. We're doing good work now, but we have to make it better. We have to make these people get their tests, and we have to try and turn this situation in the rural South around and across America and globally.
COVID has exposed the cracks even more deeply. We've known this from HIV/AIDS. We've seen this, and COVID has shone an even bigger light. And there's something that's very unfortunate about the world's most prosperous country, the world's richest country, and the fact that there isn't better access to affordable healthcare for all. It is an absolute fundamental human right, and we believe in that.
I couldn't agree with you more. It has sort of ripped off the Band-Aid and exposed this festering wound of inequality that has been existing for so long. And finally, it seems they cannot avoid appreciating and recognizing this disparity between haves and have-nots.
It's a systemic problem because it even goes right back to the education system and redlining within certain American neighborhoods, and the fact that all schools don't receive equal funding. And as a result, not everybody receives an equal high level of education. And if someone from the very beginning can't even get in the game by getting an education that's on the same level of someone else who comes from a more prosperous community, it completely makes it 10 times harder for them to get the right job, to get on a path where they can provide for themselves and they can get access to affordable health care. It starts at the very, very beginning. It's systemic issues that need to be addressed.
Yeah, the racial divide starts with education. It starts right there when you're 4 or 5 years of age and you're trying to get into a school, or even and as you go older, trying to get into the odds are stacked against you, and it's criminal. It's really criminal, and it has to change. It must change. We must change this now, and if it doesn't change, God knows what's going to happen.
You two have been so instrumental in promoting LGBTQ rights, and you've been on this issue, as I said, for so long. What has it meant to both of you to be such prominent symbols of this movement that has accomplished many things but still has a ways to go?
I think the ruling in the Supreme Court was such a fantastic result. The fact that it was 6-3 was a huge, that people cannot be discriminated or fired from their jobs because they are gay, is a huge step forward. And that needs to happen anyway. People need their basic rights. But the transgender news is not so great. And, that enrages me because I honestly think people who change their sex are the bravest people that I've ever seen in my life. And you imagine the emotional turmoil that these people have to deal with right from from their childhood. I know someone who used to sing as a backup singer in my band who eventually transitioned when they were in their 60s to become a man. Listening to his story just reduced me to tears. The fact that they said the first time they ever felt normal in their life is when they had some testosterone in their body. These people go through hell. They're the bravest people in the world. And the fact that they are being murdered, the fact that they are being treated as non-existent and not important, these are heroes to me. These people are heroes to me. They are brave. They are brave. They're like soldiers on the front line. These people are the bravest people. To take away their rights, to make them feel less than, is an absolute disgrace to humanity.
We feel incredibly lucky and very blessed. I mean, Elton's music, and music is the greatest unifying force on our planet, along with sport, breaks down so many barriers and brings people together. And it allowed people, I think, to put their arms around us in such a supportive way. We've felt incredibly supported over the years. And as a result, we felt this obligation, because we are so lucky, to give back and to help others who are not nearly as fortunate as who don't receive the support that we receive.
Everything must change. Everything must change. We must look at all situations in life, whether it's medical care, whether it's HIV, whether it's education, whether it's the treatment of how people get dismissed from their jobs, and
the justice system, how people get equal justice for everybody. Taking the prejudice, the defunding the police and putting the funding into better education and better social services, rather as opposed to just more police, more incarceration, more putting people through the courts. That's treating a problem that we need to address much earlier on.
It sounds to me that you both have been very inspired and almost energized in a way by what we're witnessing happening not only in America, but around the world. It perhaps has taken a slightly different direction or a different emphasis right now in terms of HIV/AIDS. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think within every problem there's a gift, and I think greater awareness and a greater understanding of the gaps in our system will allow us, and addressing those gaps will allow us to do an even better job with HIV/AIDS. As we mentioned at the beginning of this talk, our motto has always been "No one gets left behind," and that means the most marginalized people still have to be recognized, supported, put your arms around them and give them the care that they deserve. And Black Lives Matter has shone a light on this equality across a number of different areas.
It also makes you look at what you do. And we've always said, every time we have an event, every time we have a fundraiser, what can we do better? We've always looked at our organization. How can we make our organization more efficient, reach more people, be a better organization? We've always thought like this. Now this is really turbocharged because you have to be of service, to be of value. You just can't coast. You have to re-examine what you're doing. Times change, things change. You have to keep up with what's going on. What's happened with COVID, what's happened with George Floyd has made us look at our organization and say, right, we do great, we do really well, but we've got to do better. We must do better. We can always do better. We must strive to do better. And this has kicked us in the butt and said, come on, come on.
And Elton, I'm curious, because you and I always seem to talk politics. How closely are you following the upcoming election here in the States?
Well, it's always in the daily news, and you follow it. And of course, you have to take an interest in what's going. I take an interest in what's going in any country, but in America especially, because I have two homes in America. I love America. It's been so wonderful to me. And our sons are American. Our sons have American passports. They were both born there. Our sons are born in America. America's been very good to us. I want America to be a much fairer country. I want people to have a better deal. It's about time. And, it'll be interesting to see. I'm not going to say who's going to win or whatever, but I know that America has to have a change. It has to change, and it has to have a new regime.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Sir Elton John and David Furnish. In a moment, we'll be joined by Time correspondent Justin Moreland, who will be speaking with Carlos Alvarado Quesada, the president of Costa Rica, which recently became the first country in Central America to legalize same-sex marriage.
Hi, I'm Justin Moreland, correspondent at Time Magazine. I'm really thrilled to be here today with Mr. Carlos Alvarado Quesada, who is the president of Costa Rica. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Justin, for having us.
My first question is about same-sex marriage. Just went into effect a few weeks ago in Costa Rica. You championed this issue when you ran for president, but there were a lot of Costa Ricans who are opposed. How did you make the case that this was the right thing to do?
Well, human rights is written in plural, and there's a reason for that. It's a set of rights that cover all of the people around the world, and it's a worldview and a global ethic. So in terms of egalitarian marriage, it's a way to protect the community of LGBT people, but also it's a way to reinforce not only one specific right, but the strength of the whole set of rights. It's a message of equality and of respect. And that was the key message we tried to send. When you defend one set of human rights, you're defending them all, and you're defending all people altogether. So I know there's lots of people that don't support that, but then from a worldview of respect and of living all together, it's the right thing to do.
I'm curious, here in the U.S., there was a big change in public opinion, since same-sex marriage was legalized here. A lot of people who didn't support it at the time now support it. Of course, it's only been a few weeks in Costa Rica, but do you sense a change in public opinion since you ran for office, ran for president? I mean, are people thinking about this issue differently?
I do believe this is going to change gradually, because at that beginning it has a lot to do with being a taboo topic. But then when you see the concrete experiences of families, even with their own children, being people that love each other and their parents, and the difficulties they have confronted, sometimes people that have been bullied, even being hit, when you see those realities, then there's a lot of conscience that emerge and a lot of empathy. So even though many people might not agree with that, they also start to understand there's a very strong human part of this in terms of equality. So I do believe that as time will go by, people will going to be more positive and will agree more on the same-sex marriage.
Right. Costa Rica is the first country in Central America to legalize same-sex marriage. Do you anticipate others following? Are you the leader for the region in this regard?
Well, we respect very much the sovereignty of other countries and other regions. We take this stand, and I take it particularly for Costa Rica because that's how I presented as a candidate, and I stood for this position. Even though that I know that this might set a discussion in other places, but that being said, we are very respectful of what other countries nearby or in other latitudes, the stand they take in front of this issue.
That makes sense, but even with that said, do you have any discussions? Do other leaders come to you perhaps and say, how do you do that? Or is that something that you're talking about actively? I mean, obviously not imposing on their sovereign right, but are you having that kind of discussion constructively?
Well, when people ask me, I say what is on my mind and on my heart and on my principles. If one believes in liberty and if one believes in equality, then the right thing to do is to extend this right to all of the people. Similarly, when women decades ago were not able to vote, currently that is an idea that people say that was nonsense, but at the time there was a very strong debate on that. Similarly, with other issues such as slavery. Currently, same-sex marriage is a topic that's very debated, but I do believe that for us, the way to lead, similarly in decarbonization or in peace matters, is through example. And we choose to lead by example. And I believe this is what we're doing now as well.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the topic that you can't escape these days, of course, the pandemic, COVID, and talk about Costa Rica's response. You were praised very early on for your response, for helping, for stemming the spread within your country. What did you do right?
Well, I believe there are several items, let's say, that we got right. First of all, we have a robust social security system. So our response through our security system and through our health authorities was an early response. Also, our early detection of emergency system responded at the time. And we managed to close strategic activities while not enforcing a complete lockdown. So we closed strategic activities related to certain areas that were risky areas related to COVID, but we remain part of our economy moving. So that's part of the success, also having a strong follow-up on the nexus between the cases, and it's a very intensive follow-up And today, even though we're experiencing a second wave of COVID-19, having a population of 5 million inhabitants, we have regretfully 12 people that had died of COVID-19. But this means that our mortality rate is very low. Our mortality rate till yesterday was 0.5%, which is one of the lowest. And that's a lot because of our security, social security system, and also that population is following up on the recommendations of government, of the Ministry of Health, and also a joint work between the private sector and the public sector.
You've advocated for a multilateral approach, particularly with regard to technology, vaccine, a future vaccine. Can you just speak a bit about the importance of working together, of multilateral engagement on this issue? Why is it so important? And what do you hope to see in terms of multilateral engagement?
Well, one can see that, let's say 4 months ago, the knowledge we had, not only as a country, but as an international community, was small compared to what we know now about COVID-19. And that we have achieved through cooperation. For example, in the case of Costa Rica, in one of our institutes, we are developing a treatment that takes the plasma from patients that had recovered from COVID-19 and working with labs and, for example, working with horses. You applied certain proteins and you can come up with a plasma to apply it to people that need the treatment. And that we developed using technology from snake bites, treatment for snake bites. So we applied that technology to COVID-19. That would not have been possible without cooperation with other countries and with other institutes. That being said, this means that whenever we coordinate, it's not the sum only of the parts, but we can also have an exponential response, an exponential answer to have a faster recovery on COVID-19. If we lock ourselves within ourselves, the recovery for the global community is going to be one that's going to be weaker, slower, and that in terms not only of health, but also in terms of the economy, is going to affect all of us. Because let's say only a few countries in the developed world manage to defeat COVID-19. But then we live in such interlinked world that if the rest of the world economies are devastated, we are going to be devastated. There's no one scenario in which one or two countries overcome COVID and they are okay and the rest are not. Either we manage to recover all as a global community, or the harm is going to be for all of us.
That's a great, important point. I'm curious about, being here in the U.S., where we have an outbreak that is continuing to grow, and Costa Rica, of course, welcomes generally many Americans every year. Do you anticipate opening the borders to Americans? I mean, is this something, or I should say, in the near term?
Well, currently we're working in the protocols for opening the airport to having commercial and tourist flights coming back to Costa Rica. We still have pending the date in which we're going to do it, and we're going to do it progressively. That means we're going to start with a limited number of flights and a limited number of markets, or let's say countries. And those decisions we're going to take with our tourism sector, with the airlines, and also looking at the countries of origin and the situation. So those are the things we're going to wait on a balance for that progressive opening of our airspace. That being said, we're eager to reopen our country and our tourism to the United States. 60% of our tourism comes from the United States. We're a very interlinked, we have very interlinked economies, and our interest is in the fastest manner to reopen our space flights with the United States, but then we need to wait to have the protocols in place to make it in a safe way.
Right. Well, I want to talk about climate change. We've talked about climate before, and actually also talk about climate change and COVID. And of course, in this moment, lots of people, lots of thinkers are talking about spending money to revitalize the economy in the wake of COVID on green initiatives. So I'm just curious whether you're using this opportunity to expedite some of the green initiatives to stimulate the economy.
Absolutely. This is a great opportunity to start over, but in a more decarbonized way. And I do believe that, for example, financial plans for reconstruction and recovery had to take into account addressing sustainability and the climate crisis, addressing inclusion, gender. It's a great catalyst to think about building a new world. Whatever we decide as a country or as a global community in the next 6 months or 12 months is going to determine what happens in the earth for the next decade. It's a great opportunity to foster human talent. So we are working lots of things in education, for example, on training teachers, on building infrastructure in education, both for the economic recovery, but also to provide better services. And given that many students have to stay at their homes, we are accelerating the access to the internet and to knowledge virtually for students and also for teachers. That's one area that's very exciting. One very challenging area, on the other hand, is how we manage to have fiscal and economic stability. But that's why we globally are looking for gathering groups of countries, not with conditions, but with compromise. Compromise for better education, for reducing poverty, for sustainability, and for fighting climate change. For us in Costa Rica, one way to do it is invest more in innovation for climate change and less in military spending. That's one of the things we advocate for because we believe in that.
Right. Well, that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much. It's great to talk to you.
No, thank you. Hope to talk to you again.
Next up, we'll have Time correspondent Katie Steinmetz in conversation with Laverne Cox and Chase Strangio in a conversation about rights and representation.
Thanks, Justin. I'm Katie Steinmetz. I'm joined here by Laverne Cox, award-winning actor, producer, and activist, and Chase Strangio of the ACLU, one of the nation's leading experts on LGBT rights. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So I want to start with you, Laverne. It was about 6 years ago that you appeared on the cover of Time with the cover line, "The Transgender Tipping Point." Looking back, do you feel like we were at a tipping point then in terms of America's awareness and acceptance of transgender people? And if so, where are we now?
Wow. I'm not sure if I can be objective when it comes to that. There's been so much conversation within the trans community over the past 6 years about whether that was indeed a tipping point, theories about whether it was that moment was just about elevating me, or was it really about elevating an entire community? Was that tipping point in a space of just representation and not in the real lived experiences of trans people? And I think it might be that last one. I think because of Orange is the New Black, later that year, the premiere of Transparent, and I think the next year, the premiere of Sense8, we began to see a shift in visibility for trans people that was unprecedented, right? I believe that I was the first openly trans person to be on the cover of Time magazine, first openly trans person to sort of be on the cover of a lot of magazines and do a lot of things. And so we had an unprecedented level of visibility, but the real lived experiences of a lot of trans folks in our day-to-day lives were not necessarily changed. perhaps we became even more targeted as marriage equality became the law of the land. Chase and I have talked a lot about how there have been so many legislative attacks on trans folks in state legislatures all over the country. Of course, this administration has had this obsession with discriminating against trans people on a federal level. So I think the tipping point has been with visibility and with our voices being amplified, but I would argue that the material conditions, particularly of poor and working trans people, have not significantly changed in the 6 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to echo Laverne, there's almost a way in which that moment was like a more meta tipping point in the discourse about having a more contentious trans discourse. There wasn't room for multiple threads of trans narratives really before that. And so I think you could look at sort of that moment and the aftermath of it as sort of allowing more room for trans people to contend with our existence publicly. And that came through representation, that came through naming the many modes of violence against trans communities, particularly Black trans communities. And so I think there was this sort of narrative purpose that it served, and Laverne had such a central role in shifting the representational discourse and then not allowing it to stop there. And I think that's how I think about that moment and sort of how we then move forward from 2014 into the present and future.
One thing I'll add to that is I think one of the crucial things that I think about a lot that we talk about in disclosure is that we had to change the way the conversation was being had. Up until then, particularly on TV talk shows, whenever trans people would be on television, the conversation would inevitably sort of evolve or devolve into transition narratives, surgical narratives, narratives about trans people's bodies. And in 2014, we began to insist publicly that should not be the conversation, that conversation objectifies and thus dehumanizes. And I think because we were able to change the way in which we had conversations with and about trans people, we were able to focus more on the trans humanity and then move forward. We had to change the ways in which we were having the conversation so that we can then be seen as human, or begin to be seen as human, or have conversations about what it means to see transgender people as human.
I want to come back to Disclosure in a little bit, the new Netflix documentary that you executive produced and are part of that's very powerful. But first, the Supreme Court recently ruled that LGBT people are protected from discrimination in employment by bans on sex discrimination. It was a landmark ruling, and Chase, you were part of the team that successfully argued that case. Can you talk a bit about its significance? What changed the moment that ruling came down? And why do you think your arguments resonated with a conservative court?
Yeah, I mean, I want to take us, a step back for a minute, which is that, for years, LGBTQ people were not explicitly covered under federal law. And so the architecture of protections that we built in the federal courts was through arguments that federal prohibitions on sex discrimination covered us. But that took so much work from so many people over decades. And just looking at our individual clients and the plaintiffs in these cases, they were fighting these cases for 7-8 years. And during that time, they had to relive the trauma of this deeply humiliating and painful experience of being fired just because of who you are. Two of the individuals, Don Zarda and Amy Stevens, died before ever realizing this incredible win that they were a central part of. And so you can see the impact of discrimination on people's lives. And that was what people were fighting back against over the course of decades. And so what this ruling does is it creates even unequivocal, clear rule protecting LGBTQ people from discrimination in the workplace. That in and of itself is incredible because we've been living under a patchwork of uncertainty where some states have explicit laws, some states don't. Some federal circuits have good decisions, some don't. So people had no real certainty about their legal protections. But perhaps even more importantly, lower courts apply Title VII cases to all other federal laws that prohibit sex discrimination. So this is going to pave the way for protections for our communities in healthcare and education, in credit and housing, just at the very moment that the Trump administration was escalating their attacks in those very contexts. So this is going to have transformative effects on our communities. And in terms of why now and how did we get a 6-3 ruling from a deeply conservative court written by a Trump appointed justice, I think there's really two answers to that. The first is that the arguments were so clear and sound and righteous. The law was unequivocally on our side. Both the dissent and the majority were sort of tossing over the legacy of Justice Scalia, of who was more in line with Justice Scalia's thinking here in terms of how to apply the text of the law. But we were so right on the law. And that brings me to the other reason why we were able to win now, which is that they didn't reverse engineer an outcome and abandon principle. And that is 100% due to the mobilizing of the community in the streets over the course of so many years. And that allowed the court to actually apply the principles of the law. And I just want to say one thing, which is Laverne's presence in the courtroom that day, the presence of so many trans people in the courtroom that day, and then the visibility and organizing of so many trans people leading up to that day, and then in the 8 months that passed between argument and decision, absolutely pushed the court in the right direction. I'm certain of that, because they're human beings and they respond to the conditions in the world.
To go back to that argument, is it fair to sum up part of it as you can't discriminate against someone for being gay or transgender without considering sex on the way to that destination? And therefore, it's covered under this ban on sex discrimination, which is a very clean, logical line, it seems.
I just want to quickly just affirm too, and also because I think there's been some confusion, it covers the full LGBTQ plus community. And I think there's a lot of language and opinion about gay and transgender. And I just want people to know that bisexual people are covered, non-binary people are covered. Our community is covered, and it has massive implications for civil rights across the board. And so I just want to make sure that those who are trying to grapple with what this means really know how many people are covered.
One thing that I have a question for you, Chase. One thing I've been thinking about a lot, I'm so excited about the implications that this decision has around all federal law around sex discrimination. What does it mean in the states, right? The states that are trying to discriminate against trans children, for example. I think in Idaho, that recent decision around trans kids in sports teams, and all of the assaults that are happening on a state level. What does this Title VII case mean for that? And for healthcare, do people have to bring these lawsuits and have them sort of adjudicated, or is it just like, this is illegal, you can't do it?
Yeah, so on the first point, states are still going to be, reacting, and we see every year an escalation in state legislatures around anti-trans bills. And so ultimately what that means is we're going to have to keep fighting. So the ACLU has a lawsuit with Legal Voice, and the ACLU of Idaho already challenging the anti-trans bill that passed in Idaho. This will certainly bolster our arguments, and having Supreme Court precedent on our side is helpful, but the forces against us are aggressive, and we're going to continue to see these laws in the states. So we're going to have to stay vigilant and proactive. So that's going to be ongoing, but we have the wind in our sails, so to speak. When it comes to the rules that the Trump administration has put forward, all of those have been premised on a notion of discrimination because of sex that the Supreme Court has now rejected. That said, the Trump administration is not about to just throw up their hands and abandon their discriminatory impulses, because they are aggressively coming after us. So we still will have to ensure that the law is properly followed and that they don't exceed their authority under the statute. But there are already so many cases in the lower courts raising these questions in other contexts that we are positioned to ensure that they are stopped in their efforts, and that this decision gives us absolute clarity that they exceeded their authority under the statute in promulgating the anti-trans healthcare regulations, in proposing the anti-trans shelter regulations. So we are ready to fight, and this 6-3 decision from the Supreme Court absolutely will have a huge impact on our ability to win.
Word.
Thank you, Grace. And thank you, Laverne. I appreciate that. There are two, you both have spoken about visibility, and I want to come back to that on two levels. One is coming back, Laverne, to Disclosure, the new documentary that you're part of, that looks at the history of how transgender people have been depicted in film and TV, which has generally been extremely problematic as villains or victims or the butt of jokes. Can you talk a little bit about where you feel Hollywood is today? You know, how much better is that representation on screen now than it was for a very long time?
I mean, I think if once folks see disclosure, it's very clear that we've come a very long way. But I always like to cite the study that GLAAD did a few years ago that cited that 80% of Americans claim to not personally know someone transgender. So that means that everything that most Americans know about or learn about trans folks comes from the media. So that means that the 100 years or so of disparaging, negative, stigmatizing representations of trans folks have had real implications in the lives of trans people. I think what we've seen change in the past several years is that more trans folks are actually involved in telling our stories in the media, right? That more trans actors are playing trans roles. Now we're seeing in fiction, particularly in television, more trans writers, producers, directors, behind the scenes telling stories. That makes a huge difference. And I think because of social media, more trans people have a voice, and we're able to sort of amplify our voices with social media along with our allies. And so our voices have been amplified in ways that they haven't been before, where we are in social media. So I think that there's something very exciting about that, but there's so many more stories that need to be told. There's many more hearts and minds that need to be changed so that we can have real liberty and justice for our trans people all over this country, because we're a long way from that.
Thank you. And that brings us to another example. There have recently been large demonstrations, thousands of people coming out to highlight violence faced by Black trans women. What has it meant to you to see people coming out to explicitly say in the street, en masse, Black trans lives matter? Chase, can we start with you?
Our movement was started by Black and Latinx trans women and people who are sex workers in rising up against state violence. And that is our legacy. And that is the legacy that I think of every day in my practice. That is the legacy that I know allowed me to be here today and benefit from all of the privileges that I benefit from, that other people fought back against systemic oppression. And so to see 15,000 people or more show up in Brooklyn to rally for Black trans lives, to me, that is the direction that we should be headed in. And that is as much, if not more, of a hopeful moment than even the Supreme Court victory.
I love your historic perspective, Chase, because I think that really, when I saw not only the 15,000 plus folks in Brooklyn, but also who turned out in LA on the same day proclaiming that Black trans lives matter, that moment was the result of decades of activism. Decades of people who have fought before we started to fight or were even born. And that is absolutely incredible. And so that energy has to be continued. We have to remember that the fight might not be won right now, but there could be progress in a couple decades. But what groundwork are we laying right now so that in 10 years and 15 years, we can be in a new place, a place that is more just for everybody. And so, yeah, God, we come from some amazing people who've done some amazing things that have allowed us to be here. Isn't that amazing? That is something to think about during Pride Month and to remember during Pride Month.
Hallelujah. Yeah, and just we carry those histories, we carry those legacies. And so when we enter spaces, we bring all of that with us. And I was sitting there looking Justice Gorsuch in the eye, Justice Kavanaugh in the eye, and I was holding our ancestors, and I knew Laverne was behind me. And that is why we need trans people in trans spaces, because we know our histories. And if we don't, we're in the process of uncovering them, and we can bring those into spaces. And we have so many incredible historians within our community who are teaching us, like Tourmaline, S. Riley Norton, other people who are doing the labor to uncover our past. And then we get to share that as part of being alive.
Susan Stryker as well, who's also featured in Disclosure.
Yeah.
Can I just say one last thing, that how exciting it is for me, just thinking about this landmark decision at the Supreme Court, and that Chase, a trans man, got to be on that legal team that took a case all the way to the Supreme Court, the first case involving transgender civil rights to be argued before the Supreme Court of the United States, and won. That is such an amazing, incredible thing. I applaud you, Chase. I applaud the entire legal team for all the plaintiffs. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I think our nation should be celebrating these folks right now. And so let's celebrate them. Thank you, Chase. Thank you to your entire legal team. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, we came out that day, and just one last thing, because Amy didn't live to see this decision, and she died with the hope for a better future. And I know that one of the most meaningful experiences of her life was coming out of the Supreme Court after having to relive the trauma of her firing year after year after year, to being supported by Laverne, and then hearing hundreds of transgender people outside the court chanting, "We love you, Amy." And it was, I mean, we were both there, and it was just something I will never forget. And I know she held on to it, through her life in this fight, and asked us all to carry it forward. And so I'm certainly going to do that. And I'm just, feel so blessed to be in this fight with Laverne and so many other people.
Thank you both so much. I think you demonstrate a kind of solidarity that is very hard to erase and very hard to ignore. And it's been really wonderful to have you with us here today.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much. Coming up in just a moment, Time's West Coast editor, Sam Lansky, also the author of a new book, Broken People, is joined in conversation by Lena Waithe and Ryan O'Connell.
Growing up, I was always trying to figure out what kind of man I wanted to become, and I'm still trying to figure out what kind of man that I want to become. I always knew I was different. I didn't know that there was a term for the type of person that I was. I went into my transition just wanting to be happy. I'm glad I'm at the point where I'm able to shave. South, south, north, north, east, west, never in a hurry. Right.
One. Now don't be scared. Don't be scared. Shaving is about being confident. Oh, you're doing fine. You are doing fine.
I'm at the point in my manhood where I'm actually happy. It's not just myself transitioning, it's everybody around me transitioning.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Lansky, the West Coast editor of Time, and I'm so excited to be here with Ryan O'Connell, Emmy-nominated creator and star of the Netflix series Special, and Lena Waithe, Emmy-winning writer, producer, and actor whose projects include 20s, Boomerang, and last year's feature film Queen and Slim. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
I want to open by actually reading a thread that, Ryan, you posted on Twitter last weekend, which I think kind of gets to the heart of what we're doing here. Is it okay if I read it?
Yeah,
Do you
she's coming with the receipts. I love it.
No, I'm like,
Show
I'm
me
learning.
the receipts.
I don't know if I saw these tweets yet. It was so much going on Twitter.
I'm just going to read this now, if that's cool, Ryan. So you said on Twitter, being an LGBT person with a TV show, I am required by law to be on 40,000 panels about diversity and inclusion in Hollywood with other creators. Not uncommon for me to be on panels with the same people over and over, because there's really not that many of us. Here we are. These discussions typically veer into how we, as people with a modicum of power, can help enact change in this business, which is all fine and good. But I get frustrated because everyone knows there's only so much we can do. The real gatekeepers of this business are the network executives that greenlight shows. Where's that panel, babe? I would love to see a bunch of network execs talk about their commitment to making different shows. They're the people who decide what we're going to see. How will they make sure that's going to be reflective of the world we live in, rather than a bunch of shows starring Kevin James and hot white girls with bangs who are such hot messes? We should be talking to them, holding them accountable, rather than just talking to creators. Okay, bye. So first of all, thank you for that.
This is how we in the gay community say.
Yes.
I second that emotion.
So brilliant, obviously. And I think to me, it begs the question, why is the emphasis always on creators instead of on the systems that create so much obstruction for creators? And more to the point, should we actually be here grilling the execs who have kept greenlighting the same kinds of stories for so long? Ryan, maybe you can start and expand on your thoughts.
I think, and I'll follow up though.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
On a superficial level, I think like having a panel of like creators / celebs is more glamorous than like having a panel starring like Tom Buffalo Bill. Like, you know what I mean? It's like who, like what? Like head VP for programming at Freeform. Like no one's begging to see that, honey. But like what I'm saying is like, so I understand the idea of getting a bunch of people together that are sort of in the same struggle in terms of wanting more diverse programming in Hollywood. But I do get frustrated just in the sense that there is this sort of like, well, what are you gonna do? Like, how are you gonna wield your power? And I'm like, well, babe, like, I mean, you know, unless you're like Ryan Murphy, who truly has like abracadabra green light power, like, I feel like I'd hit a ceiling in terms of what I can do, especially with my television show. So it's like, you know, it's not like the creators aren't out there trying to get diverse stuff made. It's just that they're hearing a lot of no's and no's and no's while they're tweeting from their company Twitter like, oh my God, like rainbow pride, like whatever. And they just like literally said no to like 5 gay TV shows in a row. Like, you know what I mean? So I'm just like accountability. Yeah, so I do think though, I would love just the perspective of the people that are in charge of these like the programming of the network, like Freeform or whatever, and have them all together. And kind of, I would love to know why they haven't been greenlighting those shows, and you know, and how they're going to do better, because they are the ones that are holding the keys. And I feel like people don't quite understand that. They think that if you have a TV show, then you can totally change the world and get this made and this made. And again, unless you're Ryan Murphy, that's just not reality.
You know, how does that align with your experience?
No, I totally agree. I mean, I am a prime example of having to wait for 20s to get to the air, you know, and when you look at 20s at face value, you kind of go, why hasn't this been done before? And I think it's also important that these execs and these folks out there understand that, particularly when we're talking about the queer community, is there are many fractions to it. There just are. It's not, you know, there's still so many things we haven't tackled, like asexuality, people being, you know, what non-binary actually means, genderqueer. I'm a lesbian that is like, I consider myself masculine presenting, or in the Black gay community, stud. There just aren't, I think sometimes people think, oh, we got the L word, you know, we had Queer as Folk, you had that one character on 6 Feet Under. I think there's sort of this thing of like, okay, cool, you know, and I'll be 100. Like, I was working with Kid Fury, which I don't know if you guys are super familiar with. He has a show called The Read. He's super popular. He's this, you know, gay Black young man, but also deals with like mental stuff and has dealt with depression. And it was and he had a show in development at HBO. I raised my hand and said, let me help, because a lot of these places don't know how to deal with talent that's also not a straight white male or a, you know, quirky white girl. You know, it's like with queer people, with Black people and brown people, people living with disabilities, there's a trauma that we have, especially when we're making art and we're going through creative process. There's also a level of sensitivity that needs to happen that also doesn't necessarily exist, or is not there, or not an understanding, because it's true, people don't look like us that we're talking to that have to help us develop our shows, which means they literally give us notes on stories that only we know. So I'm grateful that at BET, because I have an Emmy, they know better than to say anything to me about notes or scripts or stories, because in essence, we're helping each other. Like, I'm like, you know, like TBS and Hulu didn't do it, and BET's like, well, we need it. We need you over here. I'm like, great, well, I need carte blanche. Cool. So we both are kind of helping each other. But the thing about HBO developed that, you know, Kid Fury project for like almost a year and passed on it. Now, I got to give HBO credit. They have been secure, and they also have this show called I May Destroy You by Michaela, which is interesting because in the past, they wouldn't have Michaela's show on because we already have Insecure. We already have a brown-skinned Black girl who was going through adventures. Michaela could not be more different from Issa Rae. And that to me is revolutionary, that they have these two shows about young Black women. Obviously, one happens to be a Brit, but I love it. They're trying to show you the like these are two Black women who are very different from each other and have very different experiences. And so to me, it's like, how revolutionary would it have been if HBO said, yes, we'll have another show centered around a Black protagonist, but he happens to be male and he happens to be queer and he also happens to be struggling with mental issues. Not mental issues, but like, you know, mental health, really. I don't even think it's an issue. It's like we all have mental health stuff. And I've never really, I personally have not quite seen Kid Fury, that character, on TV. And so now we're, of course, taking it out and we're going to different places. And no shade, Amazon passed on, like a lot of places are passing on it. It's true. You know what I'm saying? And I'm not trying to call nobody out about that. But the question becomes, why? If Dave can exist, no shade, no tea toward Dave. I watch that show like every other college white boy. But at the same time, it's like, in what world? Like it already, the show already exists. It's called Atlanta. You know what I'm saying? But he's allowed to come and like do his thing and be surrounded by Black characters. This is no shade toward Dave or Lil Dicky. I ain't got no problem with him. I like his show. You know, the fact that Rami is on, who I also love. But you can't, I think myself, Ryan, we can't sit back and look at these shows and go, well, we still got some catching up to do. I love this show that happens to be on Showtime called A Work in Progress, which is also really interesting and showing just such a unique look at like sexuality and also too, I think one of the main character, I believe, is struggling with OCD, I believe. Again, still white. You know what I'm saying? So the problem is like, I think they're taking steps, and even with like Pose, only Ryan Murphy could get that show greenlit. Pose is about Black ball culture. No shade to Ryan Murphy, but at the end of the day, Lee Daniels couldn't get that show greenlit, you know, and so there's still a discrepancy here. And I agree, we do need to hold these executives' feet to the fire, but the truth is, if you had a string of execs on here, you know what they would say? Well, you need to be talking to my boss, not me, because I don't have power. I'm here to like keep you calm, give you notes, and make sure everybody here, you know, understands that I deserve the check that I get every month. So at the end of the day, like, I would love for people to do, I'm telling you, it's an easy op-ed. All somebody got to do is literally take a photo of every person who is the head, who is at the top of these places. It's about 5 people. And the truth is, they're a group of white men. Now, somebody, and maybe one white woman in there every once in a blue moon, some of which I do business with. You know what I'm saying? Like, I work with Jennifer Psaki. I email with Peter Rice. I know Donna Langley. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm grateful to be in those circles. But the truth is, if you put a picture of them, these are people that actually determine what we see every day and what we digest. And I think if people really were paying attention, that is more powerful than the presidency. It's powerful. It's a powerful job. And they don't look like the world.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, when we went out and pitched Special in 2015, we had a lot of, our pitches went really well. And
I'm sure.
And we had heard probably like from 2 or 3 of the networks that we pitched that like they were going to make an offer. And it went up to the chain to someone probably named Ralph, who lives in Marina Del Rey.
Sure.
And like Ralph was like, LOL, what's this anyways? And then Ralph shut it down. Right. So it's like, we are a town ruled by Ralphs. And that community change, you know what I mean?
So much of what you're both talking about is, you know, this idea of platform and you know, getting the space to tell more inclusive stories, which often is about having a kind of champion, someone with power who believes in you, amplify your voice as a creator with a distinctive identity or point of view who isn't part of the majority culture. Lena, who are some of the people who empowered you to tell your own stories?
Well, for sure, David Nevins is a big one for me. I also say Gary Levine, and I mean, but also, I mean, the list goes on. I mean, there's been a lot of execs. Jennifer Psaki, for sure, who's over at Amazon. I mean, she's like, I think, one of the biggest champions of mine, because I have an exclusive deal with them over at Amazon. So, and these are all white people, you know, but David Nevins David Nevins used to be the president of Showtime. And now Gary Levine is the president of Showtime, but obviously David Nevins is now the CEO of all Viacom. And because of that, because he was in the room when I pitched The Chi all those years ago. And it was a clear sign that it meant that because David Nevins was in the room, that chances are it was looking good. And so he's known me since then. And yeah, because he's now over at Viacom, which is owned by BET and Showtime, which some people are now going to be a little confused because 20s is going to air on Showtime. And The Shy was airing on BET, which is kind of a way of like saying like, look, this is all under the same umbrella. And he's doing a really interesting thing by exposing The Shy to people who may not have had Showtime, and then exposing 20s to people who may not know where BET is on their channel, on their dial. So him using that power is really empowering me and my brand, and it exposes my work to more people. And so, that's why to me, it's like, I can't sit here and say like, all these guys are bad, all these people are bad, because Donna Langley gave me so much freedom and so much, space to make Queen of Some the way I saw fit. And I think that's why the movie did what it did. And Jennifer Psaki raised her hand when Netflix didn't, because we were out looking for an overall, and Netflix was like, we cool. You know what I'm saying, on you. And Jennifer Psaki's like, I'm gonna like really invest in you in a real way and your company, and I will forever be in her debt. So what people have to understand is like, the game is real. Like, you can't just like be an island and just make dope stuff. You need people to say, okay, cool, come on in, let's work together. And Ryan, I'm sure you had that experience too, where you have these execs who just get it and who support you. And sometimes they don't get it right away. And then once you become successful, they get it even more and go, oh, okay, I get what you're doing. The Emmy nominations help with that, and Emmy wins really help.
Yeah, no, I've had the experience. I mean, Jim Parsons, he's the producer on Special.
Nice.
And I think him being like, oh, I want to do this, it really helped vouch, because at the time I was like a story editor on MTV's Awkward, so I really had no pull whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And then I will say, and Warner Brothers, I mean, it took like 40 studios to get this short form show made, by the way.
Of course, always. One
studio for every minute. And like, I will say Warner Brothers and Netflix have both been so incredible in terms of like, not with my vision. Like, they've been really, really supportive, and they've just, I mean, Netflix, like, their notes are so thoughtful, and like, there's not that many of them. They're more like overall thoughts. And so they've been really amazing. Warner Brothers has been the same way. So I have to say, like, I've been pretty #blessed with that part of Special, with people just wanting to preserve the vision of the show and the voice. So I've been really lucky, because I know it can go another way.
Yeah, that's true.
For both of you, as queer storytellers who have worked at multiple levels of this industry, from writer's room to then creating your own shows, what do you think is the biggest thing that needs to change for entertainment to become more inclusive and equitable across the board? Is it really that question of gatekeepers? Are there other things that sort of can happen throughout the process?
Well, I mean, showrunners can obviously have a lot of responsibility, where it's like, and also not to look at like diversity as checking a box. You know what I mean? I think that there's a lot of like, okay, like we need like there's this kind of sentiment in Hollywood where like, okay, we have to, for optics, we need to make sure that we don't have a writer's room full of white people, because we don't want someone to take a picture on Instagram and then have them get canceled. I think we need to stop looking at things as the diversity box and the non-diversity box. Everything in an ideal world would just be one huge thing. And I think as a showrunner, it's your responsibility to search for the unexpected choice, because you have a sea full of like white straight guys that are looking for jobs or whatever. It's like, it's your job to be like, okay, you know what? I'm going to dig a little deeper and go for the unexpected choice. Like, and it's also really, really important, because it's so systemic and so many people are shut out. It's your job to also take a chance on somebody, because it's like, you're like, as a disabled person, you're not going to find like the disabled Meryl Streep with 80 credits and like 40 million Oscars. So like, for example, in my show, we cast the writer's assistant, who is on the spectrum, and I wrote him apart because I think he's genius and has star power. And like, I remember initially people were a little skittish, like, oh, this is a first-time actor. And I was like, babe, I was a first-time actor. I never acted in my life. I went from being like,
Same.
You know what I mean? It's like, and that's what you have to do, because again, you're not going to find Meryl, honey. You're not going to find like the disabled, like swimming in awards. Like, you have to take a chance.
Also goes for the trans community as well, too.
Yeah.
Give people grace.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the pathways that you typically take to get in, they're shut out of. So it is your job to take a chance on these people. And obviously everyone was super on board. I just remember it was like an initial thought, a concern. And I was like, LOL, like, again, I was a first-time actor. You can't even use that as an excuse. And they were like, oh yeah, that's fair. And he did a great audition, blah, blah. But yeah, so I think it's not just, you know, the Ralphs and the Todds and whatever and the Daves. It is, you know, as a job, as a showrunner, it's, you know, will your job take a little longer looking for the unexpected choice? Yes, but that's your job. That's what you have to do. You have to pay it forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of power does rest in showrunner hands. But that being said, because I really, the question you ask often does get asked to us, you know, like, how do we fix this? And I'm going to be, and I've been just saying this, and I'm going to continue to say it and be bold. Here's the deal. For a long time, white people didn't want to let go of Jim Crow. Right? That we lived in a segregated country. What I try to also too scare people is like, my mom was born into a segregated America. My mom was born in 1953. Like, that's how close it is. So I use this example is to say, if people would have just said, well, you know what? Let's end segregation. Let's end it. It's ridiculous. No one would have done it because it benefited a group of people. They had better water fountains. They had better schools. They had cleaner pools. It had to be a law. It had to be against the law to say, to get to take the colored signs down, take the whites only signs down. We need to instill mandates in this industry. Otherwise, we will not see change. This needs to be mandated. They got to say, like, you need to, like, look at the population, and it's easy to do. If you look at our population, like, Black people make up 13% of the population. I'd love to know how much people living with disabilities, how much of the population they make up. The trans community, Latino community, whatever. And that should be reflected. If it's like 13% of Black people in this country, then 13 shows and 13 movies a year at least. Like, there should be a mandate at these networks and streaming services. You got to pick up at least 13 shows created by Black people, or pick up, like, if it's like, I don't know what the percentage of people living with disabilities. Like, you have to pick up a certain number of shows created by people living with disabilities. Now, are all these shows gonna be like Mad Men and Game of Thrones? Maybe not. But at the end of the day, who gives a shit? How many bad shows are there right now with white people on it on CBS? I've lost count. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, let's have mandates and let's enforce them. And if they say, well, I don't like these, oh, well, I don't like half the on TV.
You know, we're having this conversation in Pride Month, and, you know, all three of us actually here on this have used our own personal histories as inspiration for the stories we've told, telling autobiographical or semi-autobiographical stories. Why do you think it's important to let queer people tell our own stories?
Ryan, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think because we all know the psychic damage that we incurred by not seeing ourselves on Like, I would have saved so much time living at the I Hate Myself fair if I had seen one person that, like, looked like me, but instead I bought a ticket to that fair every single year until, like, the age of 29 or whatever. Like, it, like, you know, it's so, so important to see your experiences reflected back at you. It really, really is. And I think also with queer creators, it's like, I always am talking to queer creators in terms of, like, instilling that confidence, because I'm like, you know, your stories are needed. They're so unique. They're so interesting, and they've never been told. Whereas, like, every show that gets sold, like, when I look at the network log lines, I'm like, LOL, some person, like, moves into their wacky, free-spirited sister and they're type A, and how will this work out? You know what I mean? It's like, those, like, that is done. Like, I'm over that. You know what I mean? Like, we need fresh stories. We really do.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's important for us to tell these stories. And look, at the end of the day, you want to be careful, because we don't want to restrict someone from telling a story just because it's not their own. But I do think it's important that if you are telling a story about a life that is not yours, make sure someone whose life it is sitting next to you and you're taking their guidance. But I think the truth is like for the episode of television that literally changed my life, and I'm grateful that it impacted so many others. It was a Thanksgiving episode. It was my coming out. It was very autobiographical. I mean, thinly veiled is not even the word. I mean, it was so much of my experience, and it was so specific to me that, mind you, I didn't even think it was going to make a peep. Because I just thought, like, oh, well, this is interesting, you know. But I think what I found is that I was even closer to my own community. because so many people were like, yeah, that's how it looked for me too. It wasn't like my family throwing the Bible at me, but it was more like, what are the neighbors gonna think? And I thought like I was alone in that, or that was weird. And so I found even more community in telling my own story, and people saying I can relate to that, or you know, and but also too, and people who are not of the community. You don't know how many straight Jewish men hit me and go, "That's my favorite episode of television." And I'm like, really interesting. And they'll say like, yeah, because I feel like an outcast in my family, or I kind of feel like I didn't fit in, or I didn't. And so I then had to also open up my eyes and go that our stories are just as relatable as straight stories. Like straight people like to watch our too, and can look at it and see themselves, and it doesn't have to be, you know, oh well, this is just for Outfest. Like, let's get to Outfest stuff can be in the Sundance too. You know what I'm saying? So I think, to me, it's important that we have a seat at the table and that we help to tell these stories. Because you have to give Ryan credit for, as well as like, is like what the writer's room I think looks like on Pose, and you know, and how he was very inclusive on his latest show, Hollywood. You know, I know Jeremy Pope a bit, and he got to have a voice on that show as well. It's just important that we get a voice too, because nobody can tell our stories like we can. Nobody can. And I'm telling you, whenever someone who doesn't care about the community tells it, it actually does damage. It actually undoes the work that we're actively trying to do, because they're doing things and putting things in the narrative that aren't necessarily true.
And you know why I think it's important also that our stories get told by us in this moment is I think Hollywood has a history of profiting off our trauma without giving us any jobs. And we live in a capitalism hellhole country where literally your worth is measured by your power in your bank account. And I think like I get so miffed when like people have like consultants, you know what I mean? Like there's
right, sure.
There's been some shows that have been like about whatever, and like instead of like you scan the writer's room and you see that no one is actually there that has experience, instead they're hired as a consultant. F the consultants. Hire them as fucking writers. Give them that staff writer money, honey. Like they need to buy a new candle. Like that's like that's why. But that is how real change.
Teach them how to write. Teach them how to write.
Exactly. Because it's like, I would wager to guess that like I'm one of the only few disabled showrunners. Like not many people are in this business power, but that's what it needs to look like. It needs to look diverse at the top, and they need to give in the keys to tell their own story, not because people that haven't had that experience can't write about it, but because we're in a moment right now where there's no equal playing field. And that's also why I only hire gay actors to play gay parts, not because I don't think straight people can play gay. I think they can and they do a great job, but because I know so many talented gay actors that truly would be much more huge if they weren't out and gay. So while I can, I'm going to give them all the jobs and all the fucking money. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I also speak to, I'm very lucky. I'm so blessed that JoJo, who plays Hattie on 20s, happens to be queer. A lot of the actors on there also happen to be queer, because you kind of can't ask, but I'm like, oh, I can kind of see you are fantastic. But also I want to speak to visibility and power in terms of it multiplying and other people that look like us. It's like my success, and the reason why I go so hard is not self-serving. It's because I know that we work in an industry of copycats. So because I'm doing well, they're gonna start looking for other versions of me. And that's why, to me, it's important that, you know, and me and Ryan kind of touched base on social media, and we're DMing, and I think he asked like, hey, can you come be a part of this? I was like, absolutely, whatever you need. It's important to me that Ryan be a huge success as well. And does it suck, and is that a lot of pressure on somebody? Sure. But look, that comes with being first through the gate, because at the end of the day, like, Ryan, this is bigger than you. Special is bigger than you. It needs to do well. It needs to succeed. It needs to, you know, I'm so happy that math happened, that you got the Emmy nomination. That is important. And I know people say, oh, awards can be superficial. Yeah, they are. But at the end of the day, it does increase your check, your you know, it increases your quote. It makes people take you seriously. And what'll happen is, hopefully, Ryan, if you feel up to it, although I try to encourage people to do this, if there's a writer on your staff that also has a show or idea, if you can be like, yo, Netflix, this person over here is also dope. I want to EP their show. And so now you end up broadening your empire, and you're helping another person get through the door. That's to me our responsibility. Anybody that's just successful and sitting there and counting their money, it's a sin. It's irresponsible. Like, we have to like go hard and do super well, so that way we can hold the door open for a whole new generation of storytellers that look like us.
I totally agree. Like, I don't want to be the only disabled person on a diversity panel to the end of time. Like, I hate this. that, like, my show is one of the only shows about disability, even though 1 in 4 people identify as disabled. That's a huge part of the population. And it's like, I'm the only one. I'm like, honey, like, my back is breaking under all this pressure. Like, we need other people, just so it's not just my experience in my world. I don't like that. That does not bring me joy. It gives me anxiety and it frustrates me.
Yeah, same. Yeah, and I come across a lot of queer Black people who are queer in private, but not queer in public, which again is their prerogative. You know, everybody's journey is theirs, but it just speaks to this thing that's like, and I've gotten to a place where I thought if I could be successful enough, I could really make it, it'll convince a lot of these queer Black people to come out of the closet. And it has not. And I have to realize that I cannot carry that weight. I cannot force other people to live how I live. But I don't know what more I could possibly do or how much more success. I'm like, guys, it ain't gonna hurt. But, you know, everybody, you know, has their path to walk. Allies are important.
Lena, before we wrap up, I wanted to talk a little bit about Queen and Slim, which is a movie I've thought a lot about over the last several weeks. A film you wrote that was released this past winter, directed by Melina Matsoukas, who's such a visionary filmmaker. And that film reflected things that Black Americans have known for such a long time that white people in this country have resisted or refused to accept. How do you think that movie kind of intersects with the conversations that have come to the fore over the last several weeks?
It was definitely almost disheartening to see it pop up in like top movies or on lists of things like that, even though some people may think, oh, isn't that a good thing? It's like, I would never want a movie about police killing Black people to continue to be relevant. My hope is that this film 20 years from now seems archaic. That is the goal. Unfortunately, the film was more prolific than I would have liked. But the truth is, when I was writing it at the time, there was like it always has been, Black people were being killed and their names were turning into hashtags, and I was seeing their faces on t-shirts and murals on walls in cities. And I was so frustrated and upset that it seemed like Black people are more celebrated in death than we are in life. And that really was what I kind of had to write about. And unfortunately, we as Black people often die at the hands of police officers whose job it is to do what? Serve and to protect. And we don't feel that way. And I think to live in a country in 2020 where our ancestors helped build this country for free, the least we could do is not have to be killed on the street like animals. And so if people want to revisit the film and look at it, I understand that, but I hope that my mission was, and having that ending look the way it did, was to make it, you feel how maybe Black mothers have felt over the generations, how Black people feel, you know, even if they aren't connected to some of these people that have been gunned down, killed, strangled, hung. I wanted to create characters that were so human and that you could smell them, that when they were killed by police, you felt grief. So that way, maybe a real Black person that was not fictitious, that was not on celluloid, wouldn't have to die. And there would be sympathy and there would be empathy for us as a community. But look, Spike Lee probably had that same wish when he made Do the Right Thing and had a police officer kill Radio Raheem. But unfortunately, you fast forward down the line, and I've seen Spike Lee out, and he looks at me and he goes, yeah, like, we are still telling the same story, but we can't stop telling this story until the story is no longer relevant. And unfortunately, the story is still relevant. But I do believe we're living through a revolution. And my prayer is that this history will not repeat itself again.
Lena Waithe, Ryan O'Connell, thank you so much for joining us here today for Time 100 Talks. We will hope to see you both soon.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Lena and Ryan. In a moment, I'll be back with singer, songwriter, and advocate Hayley Kiyoko. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Now, I'm so happy to welcome back singer, songwriter, and advocate Hayley Kiyoko, who we heard from earlier in the event. Hayley, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much, Dan. I'm so excited to be home, but here with you.
Yes. By the way, I love your backdrop. I see a pride
Oh,
flag.
thank you. Yes, I've got my rainbow neon. My dad loves to give me rainbow stuff because I'm a homosexual, and apparently that's what we love. He's like always giving me rainbow gifts. I'm like, that's really sweet, because like he's, you know, trying to be supportive. But now I have like all these random little like rainbows all over my house, which is great. It's great for pride.
Well, as a fellow homosexual, I have to start asking that stuff too. So Dad, if you're watching, please get neon rainbow.
I will get you a neon. We all need a neon rainbow, no matter who you love. It's nice. Anyways, back to what we were saying.
I have to say, one of the things I've always loved so much about your music is the way you normalize the queer experience. It's just so fun and refreshing to see our lives reflected in pop songs like Curious and Girls Like Girls. Of course, you've been songwriting since you were a kid. So I'm wondering, were you always so comfortable being so open about your identity in your music?
I definitely was not always comfortable with my identity and unifying that with my art. I knew since I was like 5 that I liked girls, but it was like I would never say the she pronoun in a song. That just was just in my mind, and just the way we grow up in our society, that was just like a no-go for me. And so when I released Girls Like Girls in 2015, that was the first song that I wrote actually naming the person that I loved, which was a girl. I always used like a you or just something very kind of like mysterious, and never really pinpoint who I really loved.
And so what was it that helped you get to that point of being ready to share that in a song? Was it meeting someone? Was there an artist who inspired you?
You know, it's funny. I look back, and I'm sure most people in my community have a similar journey where you meet someone and it finally just clicks. And from my experience, I had met a friend who was the first lesbian I had met. I was like 21, and I'm sure I had met a lesbian, but not an out and proud lesbian. And I spoke to her, and I was like so scared. I was like shaking, and I was like, I like girls too. Like, I'm gay. And I was like crying. And she was like, cool. And I was like, cool. Like, and she just normalized that feeling for me that I had projected to myself of this judgment. And I never really gave other people an opportunity to be comfortable with me, because I was so quick to judge myself. And so she was the first person who helped me understand what normalizing the narrative is and what that does, to be able to just go, you know what, like, all of us are different. We're all on a spectrum, and like, these feelings are normal. Like, you're going to be okay.
So I think that's a beautiful sentiment. And you gave an interview last year where you said that being gay was your biggest strength, which I think is a really powerful thing to say, and probably inspired a lot of your fans. And I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about what you meant by that?
Sure. I think for me, when I look back at my journey just in elementary school, middle school, and high school, everything yes, I liked girls, but everything I did was because I liked girls. Like I joined the dance team. I joined student council for guys and girls to just accept me, to be normal. Like, everything that I did, every decision that I made in my life was because I was living in fear of not being accepted. Being gay, I learned how to navigate so much more, and I have to give myself more credit. And I do try to remind my community, like, you have to give yourself credit, right? We're born on this earth, and we're expected to just kind of like figure things out. And like, life is hard, and everyone has their own circumstances and their own way, their own community. And sometimes most of the time we don't have our own community. And it's like finding that community around you and within yourself.
Very well said. And your fans affectionately call you Lesbian Jesus, which is...
Affectionately is a good word to use. Yeah. They say it with lots of passion.
I bet. And I was wondering, So it's an incredible nickname, but it also feels like it would carry a big responsibility. So I'm wondering, how did you get that nickname, and what does it mean to you to be?
Well, surprise, I'm not Jesus. So let's just take that weight off of me. But I think where the nickname came from, or my understanding, and I'm sure it would be better to ask my fans, but I would say creating a safe place and creating a place of worshiping yourself and loving yourself and amplifying that. And so with my concerts, and I'm sure with many other artists with their different backgrounds, it's you create this safe space that people can just be who they are and feel free. When I started opening myself up to the world, I found hundreds and thousands of people that felt just like me. And I was able to find this community, and that community gave me that strength and that power to go, you know what? I am worthy and I deserve self-love and I'm not alone. And I think that in this world with anything, we are trying to find our community because communities build us up. I mean, that's what's so amazing about Pride and creating a community is because you don't feel alone and you have power within that, within yourself.
Right. And switching gears a bit, earlier this month, amid the protests after the killing of George Floyd, you tweeted, "A shift is happening. Protect it at all costs." What do you think that shift is, and what role do you want to play in protecting it?
I mean, I think there's this massive shift in, I'm not an expert on social injustices and abuse endured by the Black community. That's been going on for centuries. But what I do know, and from my experience, is as a country and as people, we are learning and we're taking the time to learn and educate ourselves. And to grow is terrifying for most people. So that's why we just kind of stay stagnant. And it's been a really trying and challenging and heightened time for this world. But I'm also so inspired by my neighbors and strangers and people all over the world standing up for social injustice and standing by with solidarity protests across the globe, and knowing that we do have the power to change. We do have the power to be better, to treat people better, to be more educated, and to have those tough conversations. Everyone's going through their own experience of figuring out how to actively be anti-racist and proactively integrate that into their everyday life.
Right. And even though a lot of us are stuck at home right now, it is still Pride Month. Obviously, we can tell from the flag behind you, or maybe that's up all the time, yeah. But how are you celebrating this year?
I mean, every year is different. For me, I'm just really grateful to obviously be healthy, and I'm grateful that I love myself and that I've been able to get to a point in my life where I'm able to accept myself, flaws included. Obviously, I've been participating and celebrating with solidarity protests for racial injustice, and also celebrating the Supreme Court ruling that protects LGBTQ people in the workplace. So there's a lot of things, obviously, that we have to continue to fight for and to grow within our community and for the world. But I think it's important to recognize how far we've come and our individual experiences with our identity and our sexuality, and that should be celebrated because people fought for that feeling that we get to feel.
Well, that is, I think, a perfect note to end on. Hayley, thank you so much for being with us. And I understand you've got one more song for us, which is one of my favorites.
Yes.
So I will turn it back to you.
Yes, awesome. Thank you.
Running me around, got me frustrated. No, that's why I've been laying low. If you wanna make it work, baby, gotta
Thank you once again to Hayley Kiyoko and to all of our guests who joined us today. I'd also like to thank our partners at P&G for all the work they're doing to make this program and these important conversations possible. We have 2 more shows next week with some great guests in store. So if you'd like to register for those or to learn more about any past Time 100 talks, visit our website at time.com/time100talks. Thank you for joining us, and I'll see you again soon.